Hi again, guys. This is Kat. This lecture is part of a 6-piece series on critical making and space. In this lecture, we will dive deeper into our theoretical understanding of critical making by looking at the processes of what I will call space making, or the co-constitution of spaces, objects, and social practices. We will examine this by modifying the trialectic spatial-temporal model of the philosopher Henry Lefebvre to museum settings, and eventually to the artifacts and spatial environments that we ourselves make. Here, as we have discussed previously, I define space as an ongoing production that is both material and abstract in form, which emerges dynamically out of the interactions of many different actors and is connected to multiple histories and processes. These processes are variably perceived and rearticulated in relation to what the geographer Doreen Massey has called power geometries, or differentiations of mobility and agency that are experienced by each of us as a result of complex webs of both local and global relations. This means that a site like the British Museum pictured here can be understood not as a timeless place with one fixed identity, but instead as a space that holds within it many personal senses of place or momentary destinations, which are always becoming and are continually negotiated. This definition of space views both human and non-human actors as essential to its production, whether they happen to be people, artifacts, machines, or economic processes. To prepare ourselves for a deeper dive into this kind of spatial theory, we will first briefly discuss dialectics. The term dialectics in its most general form describes a dialogue between two or more actors that involves a process of debate between opposing sides. In the 4th century, classical Greek philosophers like Plato and Socrates explored dialectics as a form of reasoning that would enable critical thinking through what they called cooperative argument, or a back-and-forth dialogue or a series of questions between one person on one side and another person or group of people called interlocutors on the other. In this dialogue, the first person puts forth a proposition or a thesis to defend a point of view, and the interlocutors put forth a series of counter-propositions or antitheses that challenge this view. This form of debate, it was argued, could produce an evolution in the overall position, with each side refining their views to build a more sophisticated understanding, in doing so reaching a state of true knowledge, as described in Plato's Gorgias. Hegelian dialectics, meanwhile, was introduced in the 19th century by the German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, who modified classical dialectics by proposing a different kind of formula that would show how history had evolved through exchanges of ideas. Calling it abstract, negative, concrete, Hegel argued any initial thesis was incomplete without an antithesis, or contradiction, emerging to challenge it, the tension between the two eventually leading to a complete synthesis of combined ideas. In the mid-19th century, Marx and Engels challenged Hegel's thesis-antithesis-synthesis dialectic by proposing a new version they called dialectical materialism, which aimed to reveal how material conditions, not ideas, drive history. This model aims to depict the transient nature of economic, social, and political relations by revealing how each economic system holds a contradiction within it that will eventually lead to its replacement by a new model. The mode of production of the bourgeois, or ruling class, which they called affirmation under capitalism, they argued, would always be challenged by revolutionary class conflict with proletariat or subservient groups, which they called the negation, allowing the emergence of new economic systems like socialism, which they called the negation of the negation. And now we reach the point of this discussion, the 3D trialectic that we will use to appropriate these dialectic models in order to explore the moments of space-making that affect our everyday lives and our relations with the artifacts that surround us. Henry Lefebvre was a French Marxist philosopher and lifelong activist, whose famous 1974 work, The Production of Space, remains the most checked out book at the British Library. Known for his controversial ideas and colorful personal life, Lefebvre was associated with avant-garde art collectives of the time, like the Surrealists and the Situationists, and his work on taking back a right to the city helped inspire the radical 1968 student revolts of Paris. The Situationist International, as you'll recall from other lectures in this series, was a group of avant-garde artists and performers who were responsible for introducing the concept of dérivé, or drift, a new method for engaging with urban spaces using playful yet critical strategies, like psychogeographic walks that charted alienating developments and attempted to subvert them by illuminating forgotten traces of the lived environment. Lefebvre's associations with situationists helped him understand space not as an independent material reality that exists in and of itself, but instead as something that emerges dynamically out of actions and encounters, a means of production which, while typically dominated by the hegemony of the ruling classes, who aimed to maintain their power, could also facilitate a politics of struggle, a reclaiming of urban spaces from inequalities through action. To understand how these spatial relations might work in our everyday lives, Lefebvre built a new relational model of space-time from Hegel and Marxist dialectics. Because this model was situated around three simultaneously occurring processes, he called it Trialectic. Here space is materialized from our social realities, while time is the historical processes that have been involved in this production. The Trialectic is made up of three overlapping realms that, when brought together in dialectical tension, produce social space. First, conceived space, second, perceived space, and third, lived space. It is important to understand here that Lefebvre called this model trialectic, not dialectic, because he imagined it as a process that flows in three dimensions and also in three directions, which, as we have seen, fundamentally alters the nature of the dialectical model. While the Hegelian and Marxist dialectics were focused on two terms in contradiction with another, which are then sublated or transformed through the third term, Lefebvre's trialectic places the three terms or realms as distinct from each other. However, while they may sometimes exist in alliance or in conflict or in interaction, they do not reconcile in a synthesis. This three-way flow means all realms are of equal importance to the production of space. Together, it is argued, these realms define the spaces we move through and are intertwined with the social, political, and economic processes that produce our material worlds. And now let's look at each of the moments of the trialectic in more detail. The first realm in the spatial-temporal trialectic that we will take a look at is called conceived, or representations of space. This force involves depictions of a space in the dominant discourse of a society through productions of knowledge, which include the ways it is described and the ways it is represented in physical form, from images to maps to models to signs. It involves the power plays of states and of capital, for example, the maps of city planners, the plans of architects, and the rules and laws of bureaucrats. We can see the power relations implicit in the forces of representational space, for example, by looking at the ways a space is planned and developed, and how those ways have changed over time, based on society changing as well. The second realm is perceived space, the space of the everyday spatial practices and material realities and rituals of space dwellers, the ways they actually use the places that surround them in their lives, which allows them to perceive of and experience spatiality on a sensory level. Here we can understand how spaces affect the mundane material realities of different actors, and also how our material realities in turn affect spaces. The geographer David Harvey, who has worked extensively with Lefebvre's trialectic, puts it this way: we may not even notice the material qualities of spatial orderings incorporated into daily life through deep familiarities and unexamined routines. Yet it is through those daily material routines that we absorb a certain sense of how spatial representations work and build up certain spaces of representation for ourselves. The third realm is lived or representational space, the memories and dreams of space dwellers. Representational space is alive, Lefebvre says, because it intervenes in everyday life to modify its spatial textures, in doing so playing a key role in influencing the production of space. Here a space is usually experienced passively through the senses without much reflection, which can make it a space of domination, which is mediated by the conceived spaces that are planned and imposed for us under the dominant economic system. But it can also be a space of imagination, of daydreaming, and of creativity. This means in lived space there is always an opportunity for appropriation, where in which a physical space or conceived space is overlaid by an alternative space of imagination, its objects rearticulated evocatively in personal, artistic, or symbolic ways. While Lefebvre's triadic approach can be otherwise limiting in that it conceives of individual agency as restricted by the structural constraints of capitalism, this frame allows for unpredictable moments of contestation that undermine the dominant representations of a space. By bringing conceived space, perceived space, and lived space together, we can see that space-making is an ongoing process, a dynamic between imposed top-down plans, unpredictable bottom-up responses, and negotiations in between. Furthermore, because this trialectic has been deliberately open-ended, its interconnected domains can be appropriated for use in cultural institutions to explore interactions between humans, non-humans, and built environments. Let's use it, for example, to examine the ways a museum artifact at Tate produces space through its own relations. So this artwork here is called Norham Castle Sunrise, and it was created by the famous British painter J.M.W. Turner around 1845. It is often referenced as a model late Turner piece because of its misty, dissolving style, which was unlike any other paintings at the time. It is now featured in the Clore Gallery at Tate Britain, where it recently returned in 2006 after a world tour of galleries, along with other prominent Turner works. Now let's dig deeper into this artwork by activating a trialectic understanding of it. By doing a bit of research about its history and context, we can see the forces of conceived space in the ways it is prominently represented across Tate's official promotional materials, especially the highly publicized revamp of the Clore Gallery in 2016 after its world tour, which culminated in several rooms of the Clore Gallery being painted in Indian red that Turner was said to have used in his own gallery. We can also trace the opening of the Clore Gallery itself, which houses only Turner works, back to 1910, when the Tate Britain built an entire new wing that was dedicated to Turner after a posthumous gift from the artist himself. And the artist gave this gift on the understanding that the new wing would be used to display Turner works to the nation in perpetuity, a plan that has since been described by the historian Robin Hamlin as a significant nationalistic obligation, due to the extensive logistical difficulties of housing the many thousands of works that Turner donated. Perceived space, meanwhile, can be seen in the regular flows of people, goods, and capital that occur between the Clore Gallery and the Tate Britain gift shop down the hall, which features various mass-manufactured depictions of key works, like Norham Castle, in an attempt to reinforce a global understanding of the continued importance of British artists like Turner. And here we see not only perceived but also conceived space. These flows are intertwined with international flows of cultural and economic capital that associate Tate with other museums around the world. Perceived space also manifests itself in the flows of international tour groups and school children, who are regularly led into it during the gallery's morning hours, and the flows of cleaners who maintain it after hours, and lastly the flows of conservators who monitor Norham Castle itself to ensure it maintains its vitality. Even though the relations of these three groups are equally important in producing the space of the artwork, the daily space-time rituals of their practices rarely overlap. Lived space, lastly, can be seen in the personal, evocative, and creative interactions that occur between the artwork and the many individuals and groups who engage with it in both expected and unexpected ways. While the layout of the room which houses Norham Castle may be controlled by conceived space, for example, this does not necessarily mean it or the space that houses it are absorbed as intended by its planners. Conceived space cannot control, for example, the myriad ways the artwork will show up in people's dreams and fantasies, nor the ways that the rituals of lived space are stored up and then expressed in different ways by those who are led into the Clore Gallery when they are given a moment to themselves. They may tell the painting, for example, that it looks boring, or they may find themselves more inspired by the tone of the red paint on the walls behind it. Or they may sketch it or remix it on a bank of laptops in collections makerspaces like the Tate's digital studio down the hall, and then exhibit their works at a late at Tate event for young adults. These many little rebellions and transformations, conscious and unconscious, reveal the dialectical tensions at play between conceived, perceived, and lived space. They also reveal the many overlapping ways that human and non-human actors together produce the ongoing space that is a large public museum like Tate, and all the individual senses of place that are a part of it. By looking at museums not only through their human spatial relations, but also through the relations of their objects, we can also start to explore what the philosopher Walter Benjamin referred to as their auras, a strange weave of space and time that allows them to come alive as actors. This kind of exploration shows us how the material world that surrounds us is much more complicated and richly woven than we might realize at first glance. Now it's time for you to activate Lefebvre's trialectic model in your own way. My challenge for you here is to use its insights to dig deeper into the relations that produce the Barbican Center as a space. You can focus either on the Barbican foyer pictured here, a busy public atrium with tables, chairs, cafes, and bars across 3 floors that is open until late in the evening, or you can focus on an artifact from a Barbican exhibit, past or present. Engage with the social, cultural, and economic histories of the Barbican to discuss how the relations of human and non-human actors, as illustrated by the forces of conceived, perceived, and lived space, may be combined to produce different notions of how the Barbican can be understood and experienced. Think, for example, of the ways the conceived forces of the space may be resisted, or better yet transformed, by those who reinterpret and engage with it on a daily basis, for example through alternative explorations like place hacking as depicted by the geographer Bradley Garrett. I'll finish this lecture now by leaving you with a few questions to think with. First, how might your increased understanding of dialectic and trialectic models affect your critical negotiations with the objects and spaces you engage with on a daily basis? Second, and even more importantly, how might these affect the constitution of the artifacts and spaces that you yourself will soon make?